Hello, everybody. BSides Cayman, my goodness. Super cool to be here. Any conference that I have to blow the sand off of my laptop is a good place, and it's a place I want to be. So thanks for attending. I want to give a massive, massive thank you to all the organizers, James, RJ, everybody who put this together, the staff, the crew. This is an outrageously beautiful island, and it's an outrageously set of people that have been putting, excuse me, let me try, take two, action, I'm nervous. It's an outrageously kind set of people who have been putting this together, so I just want to say thank you for that. So welcome to the talk. We're off to a bad start. In fact, this is kind of embarrassing because this isn't a technical talk at all. So if you want a technical talk, this probably isn't the place to be. This is actually a therapy session because I've been going through a bit of an identity crisis lately. Let me be a little bit more specific. I've been going through 1 million plus identity crises lately. This is identity crisis. This is combating Microsoft 365 account takeovers at scale. Through this talk, we're going to learn a little bit about the attack surface of Microsoft's implementation of the cloud, their system of authentication, identity, what attack primitives lead to exploitation of that attack surface, and how we can combat it and hunt it at scale. So this is a technical talk. I was just kidding. That's a dumb joke that I throw into the presentation. Agenda. Today, we're going to talk, just brief who am I, a little bit about framing the problem, why we're here, what the attack surface of Azure and M365 and Entra kind of looks like. We'll talk a little bit about our key telemetry sources. If you want to hunt this stuff down, you need to know where to look in the first place. And then we get into the fun part of this, which is the attack and defense section, which is where I kind of sort of teach you, let me phrase this the right way, how crimes are done. I'm not teaching you to do crimes. I'm teaching you how they're done. There's a big difference. I don't condone crimes. We'll talk a little bit about session token theft, credential theft, OAuth, consent grant attacks, device code phishing, and then we're out. Should be a quick 50 minutes, and then I'd like to leave some time at the end for questions. That's not me, that's me. Real quick, my name is Matt Kiely. I'm one of the principal security researchers at Huntress. I am their lead researcher for their identity detection and response platform. Former theater kid, former red teamer. I used to red team banks in my pajamas. All legal, all ethical, I assure you. Malware reverse engineer. I teach reverse engineering at TCM Security Academy, practical malware analysis and triage. I like to say I'm a bow maker because if the Huntress SOC are the archers, I make the bows, right? And I guess the arrows in that analogy. I was at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, at SimSpace. I was in the Marine Corps, and I hiked the Appalachian Trail last year. I've got two great, amazing cats and an amazing wife who happens to be in the front row right here, so hey. So let me start out by kind of framing the problem here, even before we get into kind of the technical stuff. I want to start by saying this is James Bond. I think we all, wait, no, I'm sorry. This is James Bond. Yep. No, that's not even right. I'm sorry. This is James Bond. There we go. This is James Bond. James Bond is the best spy that never existed, right? If there's a mission assigned to him by M, he's going to figure out a way to do it. And he can basically get the job done, right? And James Bond is a fantastic representation of what my adversary is not, all right? Now, that's very important because when we get into the topic of red teaming, penetration testing, adversary emulation, not all of those things are equal all of the time because a red teamer, a pen tester, an adversary emulator may pick a level of tradecraft associated with the common adversary for that given organization. And I protect the small to medium businesses at Huntress. And so the good news is that the adversaries of the small to medium business are not James Bond. I'm not fighting your nation state. I'm not fighting your advanced persistent threat, whatever that means anymore. Here's the bad news, for me at least. The adversaries of the SMB aren't James Bond because they don't have to be, right? So this frames some of the attack and defense that we'll be talking about here in a moment because a lot of the time, adversaries of the small to medium business are very predictable, and they operate in predictable patterns. And it actually is summed up by Dre Aga, who's the lead of our SOC, who says in one of the blogs that we've released, most of the tradecraft that we've documented in this blog post, it doesn't exactly matter what that blog post is, isn't novel, original, or outstanding. Cybercriminals are rarely sophisticated, and the InfoSec community can beat them together through data analysis, through implementing defensive technologies. So we start from there, right? Because I pay a lot of respect to the advanced red teamers. I was a red teamer at a bank, so the hoops that I had to jump through to even stay alive on the endpoint in the first place were absolutely insane, got harder by the week. But we're not really dealing with that here, and we're not really dealing with that in the cloud space for the SMB. I would say that the adversaries of the SMB are a little more like your average run-of-the-mill car theft, like just checking door handles to see if the car is open, and if the car is open, they open the door, they grab something on the inside. That's really more who we're dealing with. But I want to, all of this is to set the stage. We're going to talk a little bit about attack and defense in a general sense, but just keep that in mind, that that's kind of the land that I come from right now. So I started red teaming big enterprises, like multi-billion-dollar corporations, the Fortune 500 banks, and it took an adjustment for me to know what's going on in the SMB, because I was like, really? That works? Wild. But anyway, I digress. What I really want to get across is that most of the time, my customers, and I bet a lot of people in this room maybe would identify with this, my customers will not get a second shot at this. So they're small business owners. This is like your donut shop on Main Street. This is your auto body repair shop. This is like your strawberry milkshake stand. Like they're small business owners that probably sunk their all the money that they did have and did not have into their business. And so a single identity attack might cost them an amount of money that puts them out of payroll for an entire month or an entire quarter, right? And that really means in the identity space, we could apply that to ransomware, that if a small business owner gets ransomed, they could easily be out the money that they had for pay. But that also applies to the identity space, because business email compromise is the thing that we're fighting most often, right? If you're not familiar with business email compromise, let's frame the problem here. Business email compromise, I'll just get all of these on the screen now, won't I? There we go. Business email compromise. Imagine that you are a small business owner and you need to pay somebody's invoice, or maybe somebody's paying you for services, and a threat actor injects themselves into your email conversation about where an invoice needs to get routed, right? And so they will hide the emails away, and then they will wait for like some kind of financial transaction to go on. This is the one we see most common. There's also like a spam element, but this is the one we see most common. And that money gets rerouted to some kind of offshore platform. And does anybody know what it's like to try to reverse a wire transfer? You can't do it. More or less, you can't do it. But here's the thing. In the identity space, business email compromise attacks, that's like the ransomware of the identity space, right? But they don't just happen. And ransomware doesn't just happen, right? A threat actor doesn't snap their fingers and say, ransomware. Business email compromise. Doesn't work like that. It's almost like that, but it doesn't really work like that. So what we need to do is any place along the attack chain that there's a good time to forestall a business email compromise attack, we need to crack down on that, right? And the biggest place, the biggest attack surface here is in initial access or account takeover, right? There's the definition from the Microsoft fraud team right there, but effectively this is initial access in the cloud space. We can broadly classify as account takeover. So we are in my nice little unscientific graph of the attack chain, we are right there at the initial access point. And to lay out the kind of topography, or the topology rather, of kind of where we are like in a concept sense, because the identity space can be kind of confusing. People, I think, generally understand like the endpoint and what goes on because you have the computer right in front of you. But the identity space, for some reason, kind of, it took me a while to wrap my head around it because I was so used to the endpoint space as well. So where we are today for this talk is right here. Entra ID is the authentication core, the backbone in an authentication sense for all of Microsoft's cloud services. And we, in the small to medium business, and by extension the work that I do at Huntress, we are in the productivity suite of that cloud infrastructure. They're all applications. The small business owner may be familiar with PowerPoint, Excel, Yammer if they're a psychopath. But they may not understand that everything that they're doing ties back into this core architecture of Entra ID and the authentication that that provides. So that's where we are. And every now and then, we are also here as well. We are in the on-premise area because Microsoft saw fit to allow businesses to hook their cloud resources into their on-premise resources as well through a whole bunch of means. And that there's an entire presentation worth of assumptions and things we could get into about that. But just from a high level, we are in the Microsoft cloud space working in the productivity applications of the Microsoft cloud space. Key telemetry sources, if we want to hunt this down at scale, where do we need to look for this activity? You need to be very familiar as a defender with where to look for these account takeovers. I have like three that I would give you, and I always miss the third one, so John Hammond, if I miss the third one, please just like yell at me or something, or throw a water bottle at me or something. First is the Entra ID logs, right? So you can go to the Entra ID portal and look at the sign-in logs. There are the service principal sign-in logs, that's like your application sign-in logs. There are the interactive sign-ins, the non-interactive sign-ins, and the managed identity sign-ins. Most of your account takeover, business email compromise stuff lives in the like interactive user sign-ins, because a threat actor will get access to an inbox and then they'll masquerade as that user and then run their playbook like that. Now the Entra ID sign-in logs give us a wealth of information. They can tell us if MFA was used to log in for this particular identity. It gives us IP addresses. It gives us all manner of other things. The user agent, very important. I'm very jealous of my endpoint researchers because they get tons of very interesting telemetry to work with. Opposite world over here. The telemetry of the identity space is scant. It's not that, there's really not that much of it. We need to go, we need to make a little go a long way in the defensive realm for the identity space. So something like the user agent, which is very well like, fudgeable by a threat actor, can actually mean the difference between detection and not detection, right? See the resource that they access there. Just looking at the other ones, but yeah. Yeah, there's not a lot here, so we got to make this kind of work. Second place to look is the unified audit log, and this is over on the M365 side of the house. I think they call it like purview. If you wait 15 minutes, they're going to call it something new. So this is over. You kind of have to. You can like subscribe to this by calling the management API, or you can go to the actual UI and like look through this. And you got to punch in some search terms, but you can get some pretty good information here. IP addresses, the user. That's my testbed tenant, HuskyWorks. Yeah, just more information, right? So again, scant telemetry. We're not off to a great start. I'm sorry, I didn't forget this time, John. You don't have to throw something at me. The third place, it's kind of an identity telemetry source, are the Graph activity logs, the Graph API activity logs. If you're not familiar with the Graph API, it is it's a REST API that Microsoft allows you to call. If you authenticate to it, you can get JSON responses, essentially, of lots of different types of resources, people's inboxes, people's emails, their user account information, all kinds of stuff. You have to authenticate to that, but everything after that point is a REST API. It's post, it's get. It's post, it's get. So, okay. So who knows what this is? This is probably the most important diagram in this entire presentation, right? This is formerly my nemesis. This little raccoon guy is this makes me laugh every time I watch it. No, this is session token theft, okay? Formerly my nemesis, right? And this is the first attack. We're getting into the attack and defense portion of this talk now. So what is session token theft? So sessions are that wonderful little technology that allows a user to provide their username and password and MFA if applicable, and then the resource provider says, okay, you're good. You don't need to keep re-authenticating because it's a usability feature. So that, like Microsoft, it's bad for business if you have to keep logging into M365 to like check your email. So they just stash a cookie in your browser and they say, you don't have to keep giving me your username and your password and your MFA, just use this cookie and we're gonna keep it in your browser, right? So there are two variants of this, active and passive. We're gonna get into what those look like, but effectively they do the same thing, just in different methods. If a session represents a username, a password, and MFA, if applicable, you may have put two factors in to get that session, but the session token itself is single-factor access. A session token is basically just a long-ass password that you don't need a username to use, right? So if you find these or you steal these, the thesis of exploitation becomes very simple. Steal the token, steal the session, you get to log in, right? So here's a little table. Not all of this is super important, but I'll just highlight the really important stuff. The system of tokens that Microsoft allows or uses for the backbone of this authentication schema, well, there's kinds of different tokens, right? And some of them are more useful to attackers, some of them are less useful to attackers. But roughly speaking, we're going to be in the refresh token area in this talk today. But all of these, every type of token that you see on the screen right now, can be used to do damage in some kind of account takeover or business email compromise scenario, right? Especially primary refresh token. That one's the really scary one, but we'll talk specifically about these two today. And these two are refresh tokens. So they're not like different than an access token or a refresh token. These are types of refresh tokens. And these are what gets stored in the browser when you authenticate, right? ESTS auth, ESTS auth persistent. And most of the cybercrime that impacts the SMB generally centers on one of these two tokens. One of them is good for 24 hours. One of them is good for 90 days. They are stored in your browser, and that means that if I somehow procure those, then I can replay those, inject them into my browser session. Actually, you know what? Oh yeah, this is interesting too. The pyramid of refresh tokens, or sorry, the pyramid of tokens, basically anything in the lower rungs you shouldn't be able to trade in for anything in the higher rungs, but you should be able to trade something in at the higher rung down, right? So if you have a PRT, you can get a refresh token. If you have an access token, you shouldn't be able to get a refresh token, and you know, accordingly, right? There are some exceptions to this, and I recommend that Dirk-Jan Molina does a fantastic job of breaking down where this kind of falls apart. So if you're interested in learning about how, like, you know, malleable the system is, you should go to that YouTube link right there and watch it. But let's talk about, instead of just like showing you tables and stuff, let's see like how tokens are actually stolen in the SMB, right? And like I said, this is the time of the presentation where I tell you how crimes are done. Again, very careful wording there. I said earlier there were two variants of this, passive session token theft and active session token theft. While the end result of both of these are roughly the same thing, the method differentiates the two. Passive session token theft is essentially dumpster diving, right? That's my shorthand for that, dumpster diving, right? So if you promise not to use this information for evil, I'll tell you that you would go on something like Mulvad VPN, which is fantastic because they do not keep any logs of your activity. Supposedly. I don't know if I trust that, but you go on Mulvad VPN, right? And you go to these Telegram channels, and if you don't know where to look for these, BreachSense actually has like a list of them, incredibly. You make a burner Telegram account, you go on Telegram, and you find one of these log dump sites. What are these log dump sites? Well, they are the logs, and sometimes they're sold, but sometimes they're available freely. They're the logs of the red line stealer, right? Who's familiar with the red line stealer? Yep. It's a blight. It's an absolute blight on the industry, right? So you make a burner Telegram account, and then you'll go and find one of these dumps, right? And these are just plain text dumps, right? So this is when somebody accidentally runs some kind of malware, like the Redline Stealer, all of their file system gets scraped, essentially, and all of that information gets posted somewhere on the dark web or one of these shady, seedy Telegram forums. And just go find one, right? The Borwita October 2359 logs right here. We're going to go and open this up. And again, you're in a den of thieves at this point, so I'd be very careful with like where you open this up, and you know, you might get more than you bargained for there. But assuming that you handle it safely, the next thing is to just plain text search for one of these tokens, right? And this is what it looks like when you do that, right? And so we see our ESTS auth persistent cookies are right there, and that basically means that that big blurred out spot is the text of the token that I would need to access somebody's account. I don't know who this is. I'm just dumpster diving. I'm hoping that I'm going to get lucky in terms of finding something that will lead to some kind of financial payday for me, right? And then finally, this is how to actually do crimes. So this isn't even how crimes are done. At that point, you would then inject it into your browser, right? So, but I warn, don't do that. That's an actual crime, and that's on you. But that's it, right? I could teach anybody in this room how to do that in 10 minutes. Like, let that sink in for a second. That's simple. And if there's no defensive technology standing in between you, if there's no conditional access policies, and Microsoft pay gates those, so you know there probably isn't, a small business owner is usually not going to have business premium or above. That's it. That's a payday for an attacker. They then just wait. They go into your inbox and they wait for some invoice to come through, or they spam out to everybody in your contacts list or something like that. So that's passive session token theft. That is dumpster diving. If we need something a little bit more targeted, that's where my good friend active session token theft comes in. It assumes some kind of interaction with the user. If you're pickpocketing somebody, like if you get pickpocketed, you can basically assume that somebody at some point like grabbed your wallet or something like that, right? So this is like phishing with a transparent proxy. We're going to talk a little bit about OAuth consent grant attacks and device code phishing here in a moment. Both of those kind of fall in to that category. Even if you have a command and control beacon on the endpoint and you dump out credentials and you happen to find some access tokens, that's also kind of like pickpocketing, isn't it? It assumes that you had access, but from there. Who knows what this is? John does. Bo does. This is my good friend Evil Jinx. I love this guy. He was my best friend when I was a red teamer. I hate him now. Adversary in the middle. So adversary in the middle, and I want to caveat by saying Evil Jinx is one way that you can do this. It's actually not the most common in the small to medium business, at least the telemetry that I've seen. More common than this are the phishing as a service kits. But anyway, I digress. I'm getting ahead of myself. You set up infrastructure that transparently proxies any kind of interaction, right? Now what that means is that you have to trick a user, instead of going to login.onmicrosoft.com or microsoftonline.com, I forget which one. Instead of going to the actual Microsoft page, you have to trick them into going to your page, right? You can do that any number of ways. But once you're there, that transparent proxy takes all of the packets of this transaction and just routes them right along, right? Or I'll actually just show you how this looks, right? Legitimate login, username, password, MFA, right? Because somebody has their phone, right? Punches in the MFA code. Microsoft goes, looks good. Here's your ESTS auth token. Store this in your browser, and you can just log in next time without providing all of that stuff. And that's what they see, right? But if I'm the adversary, I might have their username, because that's very easy to find, a little OSINT, so you can find that. I might have their password even. Maybe they had some kind of breach. They left their credentials lying somewhere, or maybe they ran a binary they weren't supposed to run, or maybe they're just reusing passwords and some other service already got breached, right? But if I don't have that device, if I don't have that MFA code, I might be able to like call them or email them to try to get that MFA code, but like you're on the clock at that point as the adversary, right? So what do? Oh, that makes them mad, right? Of course, because they're hardworking adversary trying to get a payday. What the hell, right? So what they do is they take this technology. You can find this on GitHub. It's open source, and they stand it up at some.evil.site.com, right? And then they're going to like socially engineer the user and say, hey, there's something really weird going on with your account. Please log in here, and we'll go ahead and give you more instructions, right? And again, your pretext for this, it could be anything. It could be a Teams message. It could be an email, what have you. As long as they go to that site, this is what they're going to see. But is this the real Microsoft login page? No, it's not. It is. It is. But it is routed through a transparent proxy. And just like every other proxy that you've ever seen in your life, if traffic hits your proxy and then exits your proxy, you can inspect what's going on inside of that traffic. Assume there's no like, extra layer of encryption like below TLS or something like that, or above TLS, anyway. So what you have to do is just get them to go to your site, right? And they will see that login page and they'll ferry their username and password. But then Microsoft says, okay, hey, looks good, but do you have your MFA code? And Evil Jinx at this point will just say, oh, great, do you have your MFA code? And the user says, yeah, I absolutely do. Here's my MFA code. And Evil Jinx just ferries it right along. Adversary in the middle. Makes sense, right? So Microsoft says, looks good, here's your session token. But if you're sitting at the console of Evil Jinx when this happens, and again, I'm abstracting this, Evil Jinx is just a placeholder. This could be any of the phishing as a service kits, Evil Proxy, Naked Pages. That's what you see. And that is the token that was transacted there. And once I have that token, I am then able to authenticate as that user, right? And hot tradecraft alert, HTML smuggling plus adversary in the middle. This goes a little deeper. And if you want to read more, we wrote a blog about this, Smuggler's Gambit. So this is the first time that we had seen it in the small to medium business. But effectively, I found a file that looks like this, and I opened it up locally, and this is what I saw. And this is the Microsoft login page, right? But how does that work? It's the live login page, but it's a local file. If you see all the way up at the top there, that is my local file path, right? It's going to see users husky, whatever. But how am I seeing something that represents? It looks like it's cloned, maybe, but when I put my username and password into that block, it rendered the company logo that I was logging in with, right, for my own testbed. So I knew that it was actually live. This is an iframe. It's injected into the local instance of that file, right? So instead of phishing somebody with a link, you phish somebody with an HTML file. And you say, just open this up, log in. And again, if I'm a small business owner and I don't know anything about this, I'll be likely to fall for that, right? So it dynamically, it grabs the login page, it reassembles it on the, within that local file, and then it like tees it like redirects the token once the token is generated. Anyway, that's a fun one. Okay, so at this point in the presentation, you're probably saying, all right, Matt, that's great. I know you're a red teamer. Cool, you can do all these cool hacks, whatever. How do I defend against this? And it would be against my ethos to say, that's your problem. I'm done. See you later. I don't run like that, okay? So detection chemistry, this is like a ham-fisted metaphor that I use, is that in the identity space, we have to, like I said, make use of the limited telemetry that we get, right? So we don't have a lot to go on, but if we kind of like look at these, if we cluster and correlate and strategically pick what we focus on, I think we get a lot of mileage out of the telemetry that we have for the identity space, right? And so, like I said, ham-fisted metaphor, I think of this literally like chemistry, where the sum of the chemical elements are way more than just the individual chemical elements themselves, right? So, ooh, metaphor. Session ID, device name, location, IP address. IP address is an interesting one because you'll get IP, or in comparison to IP and location, those are interesting because you'll get an IP and a location is implied by that IP, but it's never super accurate, right? So you've got to be careful with that one. User agent, device properties, device ID, and the session ID one is actually super interesting, right? Now, we have our chemical elements, but like if you want to really throw some like fuel on the fire, you add the reagents. What are the reagents in this metaphor? Enrichments, right? An IP address, like I just said, implies a geography, like a country level location or a state level location or something like that. It may not be accurate though, because what if I just use like a Tor exit node that happens to be in the United States, right? If you don't know that that's a Tor exit node, then that's going to look like it's coming from the United States. So when you try to identify anomalies for your users, hackers know that like if they're targeting somebody in the US, they should probably find some kind of VPN exit node, Malware VPN, remember, Tor, that exits in the United States. They know that, right? So what you have to do, and you can go, there are paid services that do this, but you can find this like open source, right? Is just like enrich your IP telemetry with locations, VPNs, Tor exit nodes, proxy exit nodes, data center infrastructure. Should your user be logging in interactively from a DigitalOcean droplet? I don't know. That's a question you have to ask yourself. But if you don't have that data in the first place, you won't be able to make that determination, right? So let's talk through like the actual strategy of how we would use this, right? Because we have the chemical elements. How do we actually do the chemistry, right? So let's say in the case, our assumption here is the case of session token theft, right? Login from a new location. How many of you would say that a login from a new country for your user would be enough to call them up, lock their session, revoke their token, right? Nobody in this room, exactly. Login from new location, absolutely not. The SMB moves around too much to use that as an accurate detector, right? Now, there may be cases where you know for 100% that your workers should never be leaving the Cayman Islands, or your workers should never be leaving the United States, and that might work for you, but it doesn't work for me. I've got 1.2 million identities. They move around all the time, right? I see about 12,000 new locations every single day. So just alerting on that itself, not going to work, right? So yeah, but if I told Max Rogers, the director of the Huntress Security Operations Center, that he'd have to look through 12,000 logins to find evil, he'd probably challenge me to a pistol duel. So what do? We include more of these telemetry points. We include more of these data points, right? What if we take that login from the new location and we group it, we pin the session ID and look at all of the events in that session and say these came from X and this one came from Y? We're getting better, but again, if you just hop on a plane, you could be in, from the United States to Canada or over to Great Britain or down to the Cayman Islands in a couple hours, right? So we're not quite there yet, right? But again, like I said, if you cluster more of these data points, you get a higher hit rate. What about you group the session ID, you look at the location changes, and then you find meaningful differences between the IP addresses, the user agent, the browser, the operating system, something in that event changed, and now we're getting there, right? Because that means that any two authentications in the same session, if one of them comes from France, and one of them comes from Great Britain, and one of them comes from Mac OS, and one of them comes from Windows 10, and one of them comes from Firefox, and one of them comes from Chrome, is there anybody in this room that can give me a good explanation for why that would be a legitimate session? I still haven't heard anybody come up with a good explanation of that, right? And that's exactly what I did again, you could do this with Python. You could grab all of your logs and just start to cluster them by your, so like Jupyter Notebooks or just raw Python like I'm doing here, but like cluster them by the session ID and then start to look for these meaningful differences, right, which are highlighted in green. One of them, in this case, is this is the same session. One comes from Mysterium VPN. One comes from ExpressVPN, right? Two different VPN exit nodes used in the same session. Somebody might be using Mullvad VPN or ExpressVPN or Nord if they have like a YouTube sponsorship or something, but like there's no real reason why two VPNs should be used in the same session, right? Probably. But the real kicker is that one came from Windows and one came from Mac OS. Like dead to rights, dead giveaway. So that just summarizes that. Moving on. What about identities without MFA? So all of that was like talking about detection of like session token theft, right? So for the people who are good and use MFA, that was the effective attack against that. But what about without MFA? We're really in the hurt locker if you don't use MFA. And most of the small to medium businesses don't, I can tell you that. Credential theft. Credential theft is your effective attack against that. The raccoons, man, every time. So MFA adoption rates in the SMB are not as high as we'd want. So that means that if you just have a username and password, you get to just log in if you're a threat actor. It's a sad state of affairs. So we take a couple assumptions here, right? In the unified audit log, the user logged in event is the event that we're actually looking for here. The request type in the extended properties is login:login. And that it means that there was an interactive login that did not use MFA in that case, right? Now that could be totally fine because somebody is, using their work device, but they went on vacation or something like that. But what if it also does not come from an Intune compliant and managed device, right? So don't focus so much on the specifics of the methodology here, but like this is like you start with the funnel at the top, and then you start to like pare down the detection criteria to get very focused in on like what is likely in your organization to be activity that could not possibly be explained by benign use, right? And so that's like one of these things is that if you know that all of your devices are MDM compliant and managed via Intune, Microsoft actually gives you a data field that says this came from a compliant and managed device. So if you discard those and just look at the ones that don't, unfortunately that's not a super strong hypothesis because, especially in the SMB, a lot of people just use their personal, it's shadow IT, it's a whole thing. And that's why I say like a rogue device is kind of its own threat model. But like you can make this work. Like if it's coming from an OS that you've never seen before, if it's coming from a browser that you haven't seen for this user, that's a decent way to attack that problem. But this one, I would say, of the two, of session token theft and credential theft is the harder one to get true positives on, what I've found. OAuth consent grant attacks. Shout out to Bo. Very quickly, we're going to speed through this a little bit. I've got about 18 minutes left. That's actually not bad. Who has used like applications? Who has seen this on the right side of the screen here? Ignore the application name itself because that's not super important. But if you've seen this on the right side of the screen, this is the customer-facing, the like Microsoft customer-facing experience when you install an OAuth application in your Microsoft 365 tenant, right? So applications do all manner of things, and this is like how they hook into Entra. And it's a more complicated thing than I think I want to get into in this talk, but I gave another talk about this a couple weeks ago. This is basically how like you would install like an integration into your calendar to like sync up your calendar to your team maybe, or something to back up your emails or something like that. Now, the interesting thing is that you, as an attacker, that presents an attack surface with this, right? So you, as an attacker, can either create a malicious application and try to get somebody to install it, or if you've already accessed the tenant, you can install a malicious application yourself and use that for persistence. So there's good attack primitives for initial access and persistence with these two, right? So we're not going to worry about like the technicals of this, but this is usually what that ends up looking like, is that you've got your user who gets an email from IT and it says, hey, install our new application, just click on this link, sign in with your username, your MFA if applicable, click accept, don't ask too many questions, right? So so this is what the user says. Maybe they've gotten security awareness training and they say, well, I've been taught to look for like sus.baka.whatever.evil. But like this is coming from login.microsoftonline.com, right? So it's probably fine. But what they don't realize is that this is hijacking the legitimate OAuth application authentication flow, the flow for auth-z and auth-n, authorization and authentication respectively. This is what's going on here, and they may not realize it, but there are a couple of dead giveaways here in that there's a redirect URI that goes to some IP address, and there's a set of scopes. In OAuth, you will consent to the permissions for your given, if it's like a delegated app, you can say, yeah, you can access my calendar, you can access my emails, you can do all that kind of stuff. So that also is part of this as well. And then this is what they'll see, and they'll just say, oh yeah, sure, totally, accept. And they may even consent on behalf of their entire organization if they can do that. By default, in Entra, every user can install any application. Every user can consent to the permissions that are effective for their own assets, right? And you can change that in Entra, and I recommend that you do. If you're a red team operator like I was on this engagement, this is what you see when somebody does that. That access token that's generated by the legitimate OAuth authentication flow goes to your particular URL, and congratulations, you are now in possession of an access token. And as an attacker, you can then trade that in for some other kind of access or continue your engagement. You also get a refresh token down there too, which is like even better. Right. That's a little closer just to see. For detection criteria for this, nothing is better than if you have the actual link for this one in a forensic sense, right? Because to recreate this from the telemetry has proven to be very difficult, but if you can reach into the browser history of the particular victim or a suspected victim, you will be able to see that URL in its entirety, and that's gold right there, because you can see immediately that there's some kind of client app IP, there's a URL associated with that, and then the permissions that they have requested. And finally, for attack and defense section, device code phishing. Who in the room has used, besides you two, I know you two have, who in the room has used the Microsoft device code authentication flow in a legitimate way? That's cool. That's very cool. Notice how 99% of the room did not raise their hand, right? This is a very niche piece of functionality that serves a very small subsection of the types of users in M365 that has a disproportionately massive attack surface associated with it. And what this does is that if you have a device that has like they call it like an input restricted kind of device, I think that's the term, but effectively think like a printer or a smart TV or like something that doesn't have a terminal. And you need to authenticate that, and you can authenticate that stuff into your M365 tenant for some reason, and you want to do that, you can request a token at something that does have a terminal and a keyboard, right, like your browser, and then you can punch in a code on that device, and then you can authenticate that device from somewhere else, right? And like any good, sufficiently complicated system of authentication, that leaves us with a beautiful attack primitive to request that code ourselves as the attacker, and then socially engineer somebody to punch it in on their end as the victim. And you can do any number of things, like you can send them something from Microsoft that says, hey, go to microsoft.com/device-login, please punch in this code. And again, if I've been trained via security awareness training to look for sussy.baka.evil.site, I'm going to say that looks totally fine. Microsoft.com/device-login, that looks totally OK. So then the victim will bite. They'll go to the device code login portal, the legitimate one. They'll punch in their username, their MFA if applicable. And then if you, on the other end, as the attacker, then just request the endpoint that you'll retrieve the token from, you can keep doing this. These codes are active for 15 minutes, so you're kind of on the clock. But if you successfully phish somebody, you just keep requesting this endpoint. Hey, have they authenticated yet? Nope. Hey, have they authenticated yet? Nope. Hey, have they authenticated yet? Yes. And you get yourself an access token. Detection for device code phishing. There's one particular field in here that I think it deserves special attention, which is the original transfer method is device code flow, and that's going to be in the Entra ID sign-in logs. If I could have one field to hunt that down, that's what it would be. And also, the requested, the login request type, the extended property request type is CMSI, CMSI:CMSI, right? And that is device code authentication was used. That's the device code flow. So again, this is it's just more of the same. It's like co-opting the legitimate authentication process to inject yourself as the attacker into somebody's accesses, right? And this is just one of those. So I said, additional detail here. This will also satisfy MFA. So again, this is a good MFA bypass if you can trick somebody into doing it. And there's your device code flow original transfer method right there. So that's it. And I guess if I could sum it up, I would say it's not all bad news because, like any good system of defense, account takeover is just one stop along the attack chain, right? And account takeover happens to be one of the, maybe the biggest one, but there are other things that telegraph threat actor activity in your environments, right? Maybe they added a rogue MFA device. Maybe they installed a backdoor into a service principal with a password, right? Maybe they create some inbox rules to actually stage that business email compromise, right? But the good thing about business email compromise, if there is one, if there's an upside, is that unlike ransomware, if you walk into work and you open your laptop and you see the ransomware background, you're cooked, right? Like, that's it. But business email compromise actually is like setting a trap, right? So there is a lag time between when those inbox rules are set up and when somebody would have to reroute a financial transaction. And so there's still time, essentially. Even if you fall victim to account takeover, even if you get these inbox rules staged, until somebody actually completes one of those transactions, there's still time to intervene. There's still time to save. And we're lucky in the identity space that that's the case, because over on the endpoint side of the house, like, again, when you see ransomware, you're cooked. So line up those layers of Swiss cheese, and that's all I got for you today. So my name is Matt Kiely, and I'd be happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you, Matt. We've got a couple minutes. Anyone have any questions for Matt? It's been very informative.
I guess as a really quick thing, I think you mentioned earlier that you work currently on the blue team side of things for detection.
Yep.
And I imagine you work with all sorts of organizations with different use cases and different tooling.
Yep.
You did mention the use of coding with logs that are already existing within those Office 365 applications, but I'm wondering if you're familiar with whether, for example, Microsoft Sentinel has these built-in use cases already for these sorts of detections.
Yeah, so Microsoft is famously opaque about their defensive implementation, right? And so while we could get things like the risky user sign-in logs, or like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint sends alerts a lot of the time, they will tell us sometimes that something has gone wrong, but they don't really say what in a lot of cases. So you may have an IP, and you can kind of infer that, you know, it was a login from X country, and that constitutes a risky sign-in. Unfortunately, Microsoft is very opaque about why. You know, they've got probably algorithms and machine learning and AI that completely eclipses my understanding. They've probably got a lot of stuff behind the scene going on to make these determinations. But I guess they have a vested interest in making sure that the information gets to the customer but isn't overwhelming. So they'll tell you, risky sign-in, or this user is risky, but they don't usually say why.
Right. So they're doing things to protect you, but it's probably better to have your own redundant form of detection as well?
I'll put it to you this way. I mean, in the SMB, Microsoft has come out a couple of times at this point and said, we've made it harder for token theft to succeed. We've made it easier to implement MFA. We've made it better. We've made it this. We've made it that. I still see these attacks every single day. So I'm not saying they're not doing their job, but the attacks are still succeeding. And even if session token theft one day is declared dead because of device-bound encryption or something like that, which it probably won't, but it's just more of the same. It has to be implemented everywhere, right? And it usually isn't. It has to be easy to use, or else users are going to say, I don't want to use that, right? I don't want to use phishing-resistant MFA. I don't want to use a little device code token. Like, and even if those two things, if we assume that both of those were the case, that everybody's using it unilaterally and it's easy to use, threat actors are going to find some other way. Durkheim, that blog post, shows a method of phishing-resistant MFA, if that's any indication, right? So cat and mouse, as always, but Microsoft is actively making it harder for these attacks to succeed, but they're still succeeding every single day.
Thanks, that's really insightful. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks for a great presentation. I know that it used to be the case that Microsoft E5 was the only level that would provide the level of logging that would be useful for serious business or larger business. The level of logging that you've been showing here in your examples, I'm thinking for the friends and family, small business owners, what is the bare minimum that you could possibly recommend to friends or family who don't want to pay the E5 fee?
Yep. So everything that you saw in here is available at the business standard level. And the reason is because my test bed is at the business standard level, because I can't assume, and this goes kind of into the Huntress product side of the house, and I know that's not what people came here for, but like, I can't assume that everybody at Huntress is going to have above that license level. I have to assume that that's the level I have to build for. So all of the telemetry that you saw there today was at the business standard level, just the bare minimum. You're paying for a license, but you're not paying for anything above that level. And I don't know if I have recommendations, because it's like foundationally against my ethos to be like, oh, it's great to pay for security features that you should be getting for free, right? So like, yeah, so I guess that's how I would summarize it, is like, I would ask of Microsoft to make, like we saw last year after the breach, which the threat actor's name escapes me right now, but they made graph access logs available to everybody, right? So like, but should it take breaches like that to really push that down? I'm pretty sure Microsoft is doing fine, probably. They could make all of this telemetry available, all of the premium telemetry available to everybody instantly if they wanted to. So yeah, that's what I would ask of Microsoft. And I don't think I have a recommendation, because just personally, I don't believe that you should have to pay like a premium license fee to get things that could prevent a yogurt shop from getting ransomed, right? So I don't know if does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. It was really just not even a recommendation, but what you could say to friends and family without feeling really guilty yourself. But I think you answered it.
Yep. Yep. Business standard and a little bit of elbow grease with pulling your logs and correlating with Python. I mean, that'll get you there, right? I didn't show anything in here that you can't do by grabbing those logs and correlating them manually, or putting them into your own SIM or some kind of data store.
So you would still want them to have some kind of protection, right? Okay, I think we've got another speaker, if that's the last question. Thanks, everyone. I think we've got a couple minutes before the next. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much.